The Black Death, the plague that killed half of Europe and changed everything. There's a churchyard in rural England where the headstones run out, not because the parish grew small, but because in a single year, sometime around 1349, there was no one left to carve them. The village of Iam would later become famous for a later outbreak, but across England, France, Italy, and beyond, thousands of settlements simply stopped. Houses stood with food still on the table. Livestock wandered untended through fields no one had harvested. Entire streets fell quiet in a matter of weeks, and the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of erasure. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. Within 4 years, it had moved from the ports of Sicily to the fjords of Norway, killing somewhere between a third and half of every human being it encountered. No army in history has ever moved so fast or left so little standing. But the plague was never only a story of death. It was a story of what death, arriving at that scale and speed, does to the living, to their faith, their institutions, their sense of what the world owed them. And to understand what it unmade, we must first understand what it found. To understand what the Black Death destroyed, you have to first hold in your mind the world it walked into, not the romanticized version, not the castles and candlelight of popular imagination, but the real medieval Europe of the early 14th century. Dense, layered, surprisingly interconnected, and held together by a set of beliefs so deeply embedded that most people living within them could not have imagined their absence. Europe in 1300 was a civilization in motion. After centuries of fragmentation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, something resembling order had slowly reasserted itself. Towns had grown into cities. Trade routes linked the wool merchants of England to the cloth markets of Flanders, to the banking houses of Florence, to the spice traders arriving from the eastern Mediterranean. The population of Europe had roughly doubled over the previous 3 centuries, climbing towards 75 million people. Paris held perhaps 200,000 souls within its walls. Venice was a labyrinth of commerce and stone rising from a lagoon. London, cramped and smoky and loud, was expanding beyond its old Roman boundary. This growth was real, but it was also precarious in ways that few people recognized at the time. European agriculture was running near its ceiling. The continent's farmland was feeding the population, but only just. A series of catastrophic famines between 1315 and 1322, triggered by years of cold, wet weather that rotted crops in the field, had already killed millions across northern Europe. Whole communities had been weakened, their immune systems quietly compromised, their stored reserves of grain exhausted. The continent recovered after a fashion, but it had been shown something about its own fragility and had not fully absorbed the lesson. Beneath the economics lay the architecture of belief. The Catholic Church was not simply an institution in evil Europe. It was the organizing principle of reality. It explained why people suffered, why they died, and what suffering and death meant. It administered the sacraments that marked every transition of a human life: birth, marriage, penance, last rites. Its calendar structured the year. Its priests stood at the intersection between the living and whatever came after. To be outside the church was not merely a social misfortune. It was, in the understanding of the time, to be cut off from salvation itself. This gave the church extraordinary power, but it also created an extraordinary liability. When the church explained suffering, it did so through a framework of sin and divine justice. Plague, flood, and famine were the instruments of a God who punished human failing. This was not cynicism. It was the sincere cosmology of an entire civilization. And it meant that when catastrophe arrived at a scale no one had ever witnessed, the church would be expected to account for. The explanation was already built into the system. What was not built in was any mechanism for what happened when the explanation failed. The feudal structure that organized European society was similarly both functional and brittle. At its foundation was land and obligation. Lords held land, peasants worked it, and in return received protection and a degree of stability. It was an arrangement that locked people in place, legally, geographically, generationally. A serf in 14th century France or England did not choose his occupation or his location. He inherited them, and his children would inherit them after him. The system had endured for centuries, and its endurance had come to feel like permanent. The merchant class was beginning to complicate this picture. In the growing cities, wealth was increasingly being narrated not through land but through trade, finance, and craft. The great banking families of Florence, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, were extending credit to kings. The guilds of the northern European cities were accumulating political weight alongside their commercial power. The feudal order was not yet threatened, but it was being quietly renegotiated at its edges, and the people doing the renegotiating were concentrated in exactly the kind of dense, interconnected urban environments where a plague would move fastest. What medieval Europe did not have, could not have had, was any understanding of contagion in the modern sense. The dominant medical framework of the era, inherited from ancient Greek thought and filtered through centuries of Arab scholarship and Christian theology, understood disease as an imbalance of internal humors, or as the effect of corrupted air, what was called miasma. The idea that an invisible living organism could pass from one person to another and replicate itself within a new host was entirely outside the conceptual vocabulary of 14th-century medicine. Physicians were educated, often genuinely learned by the standards of their time, and completely without the tools they would have needed. So this was the world that sat waiting in 1346, populous, productive, expanding, and threaded through with connections it could not yet fully see. A world whose institutions rested on explanations for suffering that had never been stress-tested against suffering at this scale. A world full of people who believed with complete sincerity that the arc of history bent toward a divine plan, and that even death, properly understood, carried meaning. The plague did not share this understanding. It had no theology. It made no distinctions between the pious and the corrupt, the lord and the serf, the physician and the patient. It was moving west along the roads of Central Asia, carrying in the blood of rodents and the bodies of fleas, crossing the steppes toward the great trading ports of the Black Sea. And the same routes that had brought silk and spice and silver into European life were now carrying something else entirely, something for which the medieval world had no name, no precedent, and no defense. The plague did not begin in Europe. It began somewhere in the vast interior of Central Asia, most likely in the region around modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where historical grave markers from the late 1330s record an unusual spike in deaths with inscriptions that some historians have interpreted as references to pestilence. The exact origin remains debated, and perhaps it always will. What is clear is that by the early 1340s, the disease was moving, and the routes it followed were not random. They were, with a terrible precision, the most traveled and most profitable corridors of the medieval world. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a web of overland and maritime routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, threading through Persia, the Caucasus, the steppes of Central Asia, and the great trading cities of the Middle East. For centuries it had carried silk, porcelain, spices, and ideas westward, and silver, wool, and glass eastward. It had also, invisibly and without anyone understanding the mechanism, carried the plague of Justinian in the 6th century had likely traveled similar pathways, but the medieval Silk Road of the 14th century was more active, more densely trafficked, and more deeply integrated into European commercial life than anything that had come before. It was, in other words, a faster highway. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, lived primarily in the bloodstreams of rodents, particularly the black rat, and was transmitted between hosts by fleas. When an infected flea bit a human being, it deposited the bacterium into the bloodstream. The lymphatic system, attempting to contain the infection, produced the swollen, blackened nodes, the buboes that gave the disease one of its names. In its bubonic form, it killed roughly half of those it infected within days. In its pneumonic form, spread through the air by coughing, it was nearly always fatal. The medieval world had no way of knowing any of this. What they experienced was simply, people became ill, they swelled, they darkened, they died, and then the people who had cared for them began to die as well. The plague reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, on the northern shore of the Black Sea, around 1346. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, a node of extraordinary commercial importance, where goods from the eastern overland routes transferred onto ships bound for the Mediterranean. The Mongol forces besieging the city at the time were themselves suffering from the plague, and according to one account, they catapulted the corpses of their dead over the city walls. Whether or not this specific act of biological warfare occurred exactly as described, the result is not in doubt. The Genoese merchants I. and Caffa boarded their ships and sailed west. They carried the plague with. In October 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying or already dead. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately, but it was too late. The plague had come ashore. Within weeks it was moving through Sicily. By early 1348, it had crossed to the Italian mainland, reaching Genoa, Venice, and Pisa almost simultaneously, three of the most densely populated, commercially active cities in Europe. From Italy, it moved in every direction at once, following the roads and rivers of medieval commerce with a geographic logic that, in retrospect, reads like a diagram of European trade. It reached southern France in the spring of 1348, killing tens of thousands in Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, so quickly that Pope Clement VI authorized the burial of the dead in the Rhone River when the city's cemeteries filled beyond capacity. It moved north through France and east through the German states. It crossed the English Channel in the summer of 1348, landing first in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, then spreading inland and northward through a country that had no idea what was coming. By 1349, it had reached Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic states. By 1351, it had moved deep into Russia. The speed of this journey was itself a kind of violence. Communities had almost no warning. A town might receive word that a neighboring village was suffering, and then, days later, begin burying its own. The very mechanisms of warning were themselves vectors of transmission. The messenger who brought news of the plague in the next valley might already be carrying it. The merchant who arrived from the south with his cart of cloth brought something invisible alongside his goods. Flight, which was the instinctive response of those who could afford it, scattered infected individuals into new communities and accelerated the geographic spread. There was no behavior within the understanding available at the time that reliably saved you. What the map of the plague spread reveals, when you trace it carefully, is something that goes beyond the history of a single catastrophe. It reveals the skeleton of medieval civilization, the roads, the ports, the rivers, the trade corridors that had been built up over centuries to move wealth across the continent. The plague moved along these lines not because it chose them, but because people moved along them, and where people moved, the flea moved, and where the flea moved, Yersinia pestis followed. The infrastructure of prosperity became, with no adjustment at all, the infrastructure of mass death. By the time the first major wave began to exhaust itself in the early 1350s, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe were dead. The estimates vary, and they always will. The record-keeping of the era was itself a casualty of the plague, but the scale, even conservatively measured, is almost impossible to hold in the mind. In some regions, the losses approached 60% of the population. Entire villages ceased to exist not because they were abandoned, but because there was no one left. The continent that emerged from the first wave was not simply smaller. It was disoriented, full of survivors who had watched everything they understood about the world fail to protect them, and who were now living in a landscape of empty houses, untended fields, and questions that the old explanations could no longer answer. There is a particular kind of fear that arrives not in a single moment but in accumulation. It builds with each new death, each new failure of remedy, each prayer that goes unanswered in the way prayers are supposed to be answered. By the time the plague had been moving through Europe for a year, this accumulated fear had become something more corrosive than panic. It had become a fundamental uncertainty about the nature of reality itself, about whether the world was structured the way everyone had always been told it was structured, and whether the people entrusted with explaining that structure had any real authority at all. The first institution to visibly buckle was the church. This was not because the church was weak. It was because the church had built its authority on the claim that it stood between human beings and the forces that governed their fate. Its priests administered last rites, the sacrament that prepared a soul for the passage out of this world. Without last rites, in the theology of the time, a soul faced a deeply uncertain eternity, and now priests were dying faster than they could be replaced. In some dioceses across France and England, records show that clerical mortality ran as high as 40 or 50%. The priests who survived faced an impossible arithmetic: more dying than could be reached, more last rites to perform than hours in the day, more grief than end. Why institutional structure had been designed to absorb. Many priests fled. This was not unique to the clergy. Flight was the universal human response to the plague across every class and occupation. But when a lord fled his manor, the symbolic order of the feudal world was shaken. When a physician fled his patients, the pretense of medical authority collapsed. When a priest fled his parish, something deeper broke. The church had taught for generations that the spiritual shepherd did not abandon his flock. The sight of empty rectories and locked church doors in the middle of a catastrophe did not produce anti-clerical rage immediately. That would come later, and slowly. What it produced first was a quieter, more devastating sensation, the feeling of being alone in the universe in a way that the entire structure of medieval life had been designed to prevent. The medical profession, such as it was, fared no better in terms of practical outcomes and little better in terms of credibility. Physicians trained in the Galenic tradition of humoral medicine recommended bloodletting, changes in diet, the burning of aromatic herbs to purify corrupted air, and the avoidance of emotional extremes. Some of these recommendations were harmless. None of them worked. The Faculty of Medicine in Paris, asked by the French king to explain the plague, produced a formal report in 1348 attributing it to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which had caused a corruption of the surrounding air. This was not ignorance dressed as knowledge. It was the best available framework applied in good faith to a phenomenon entirely outside its explanatory range. But the result was the same. The dying continued, and the people who were supposed to understand why could offer nothing useful. Into this vacuum of explanation moved stranger and more desperate responses. The flagellant movement, which had existed in Europe before the plague, but now swelled into something vast and terrifying, sent processions of men and women through the streets of German, Flemish, and French cities, beating themselves with leather straps and iron-tipped whips, their backs open and bleeding, chanting as they walked. They believed with complete sincerity that public penance on this scale might satisfy whatever divine anger was driving the catastrophe. At its peak, the movement numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It moved through cities like a fever dream, drawing crowds, generating intense emotional release, and offering the one thing the church and the physicians could not, the sensation of doing something, of having some agency in the face of an unkillable enemy. The church, initially tolerant of the flagellants, eventually condemned them. The movement was becoming too independent, too theologically unruly, too threatening to ecclesiastical authority. Pope Clement VI issued a bull against them in 1349, but the fact that ordinary people had turned in such numbers to self-inflicted violence as a spiritual solution said something that no papal document could quite unsay. It said that the institutional church had failed, in the eyes of enormous numbers of its own faithful, to provide adequate answers, and that people were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to find answers somewhere else. The most savage expression of this search for explanation fell upon Jewish communities across Europe. The accusation that Jews had deliberately poisoned the wells and caused the plague had no basis in fact, and required a determined suspension of observable reality, since Jewish communities were themselves dying of the plague at comparable rates. But the accusation spread faster than the plague itself, moving through the German-speaking lands in particular with a momentum that local authorities often could not or would not stop. In Strasbourg in February 1349, 2,000 Jewish residents were burned alive. This before the plague had even fully arrived in the city. In Mainz, in Frankfurt, in Cologne, in hundreds of smaller towns across the Rhine Valley and beyond, Jewish communities were massacred, their property seized, their neighborhoods destroyed. These were not spontaneous eruptions of mindless violence, though they contained that element. They were the expression of a civilization under impossible pressure, reaching for an explanation it could act upon, a cause it could name, locate, and destroy. The plague could not be fought, but a neighbor could. The violence was a measure of how completely the normal frameworks for managing fear had broken down, and how dangerous that breakdown could become when it was pointed at a specific human target. What makes this period so difficult to look at directly is not only the scale of the dying, but the quality of the disorientation. These were not primitive people. They were farmers and merchants and scholars and priests who had built, over centuries, a genuinely sophisticated civilization. They had cathedrals and universities, legal codes and trade networks, poetry and philosophy. And none of it, not one thread of it, gave them any real protection against what was happening or any adequate language for what they were experiencing. By the early 1350s, the first great wave was receding, but the world it left behind was not simply damaged. It was full of people who had watched everything they trusted fail and who were now standing in the wreckage, trying to decide what, if anything, still deserved to be believed. There is a painting completed in Pisa sometime around 1336, just before the plague arrived, a vast fresco called the Triumph of Death, covering an entire wall of the Campo Santo cemetery. It shows wealthy figures on horseback encountering a pile of rotting corpses, angels and demons fighting over souls in the sky above. Historians have long debated whether it was painted in anticipation of the plague or simply reflected the medieval preoccupation with mortality that already existed. What is certain is that after 1350, this preoccupation became something different in character, less theological, more visceral, more personal. Death in European art stopped being an abstraction and became a present, a figure, something that sat beside you at the table and would not be politely ignored. This shift in how Europeans related to death was not merely aesthetic. It was the surface expression of a reorganization happening at every level of society simultaneously: economic, institutional, psychological, and spiritual. The plague did not cause all of these changes by itself. Many of the forces it accelerated were already present, already in motion beneath the surface of medieval life. But the plague compressed time. It took processes that might have unfolded across centuries and drove them through a single catastrophic generation, leaving survivors to navigate a landscape that had changed faster than anyone had the conceptual tools to fully comprehend. The most immediate and measurable transformation was economic. Roughly a third to a half of Europe's labor force was dead. Land that had been fought over, taxed, and hoarded for generations was suddenly available. Crops rotted in fields not because the harvest had failed, but because there was no one left to bring it in. And the peasants and laborers who survived found themselves in a position that would have been almost unimaginable to their parents. They were needed, desperately, urgently needed. Landlords who had spent generations extracting maximum labor from legally bound serfs now competed with one another to attract the workers who remained. Wages rose. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to legally freeze wages at pre-plague level, an act of desperation by a ruling class that could feel the economic ground shifting beneath it. The statute was widely ignored. The market had its own logic, and that logic now ran in the laborers' favor. This did not produce equality, and it did not happen smoothly. The decades following the plague were full of social conflict, peasant revolts, urban uprisings, bitter renegotiations of the terms on which ordinary people would agree to work and live. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, the Ciompi uprising in Florence. These were not caused solely by the plague, but they were all shaped by the new awareness, born in the plague years, that the social order was not a fixed law of nature. It was an arrangement, and arrangements could be contested. The church emerged from the plague years alive but diminished in a way that its own structures could not fully absorb or acknowledge. The institution itself survived. The rituals continued. The cathedrals still stood, more magnificent than ever, built in some cases with the concentrated wealth of reduced populations. But the authority that rested beneath the ritual, the unquestioned assumption that the church's explanations were adequate, that its intercessions were reliable, that its hierarchy reflected a divine order, had been quietly, irreversibly compromised. The clergy who had fled, the prayers that had gone unanswered, the theological framework that had offered sin as the explanation for a catastrophe that killed the pious and the corrupt in equal measure. All of this had deposited a residue of doubt that would not dissolve. The men who would eventually become the reformers of the 15th and 16th centuries were not, in most cases, drawing directly on plague-era grievances, but they were inheriting a church whose credibility had been stress-tested and found wanting in living memory, a church that a significant portion of its own faithful had watched fail at the most fundamental level, in the most terrifying circumstances. The Reformation did not emerge from the Black Death, but the ground in which it took root had been turned by it. Something similar is true of the Renaissance, though the connection is more oblique and more contested. The intellectual and artistic flowering that began in the Italian city-states of the 14th and 15th centuries drew on classical sources, on accumulated wealth, on the specific social conditions of urban merchant culture. But it also drew, in ways that are harder to quantify, on a changed relationship with human mortality and human agency. When Petrarch wrote about the individual human life as something worth examining in its own right, when Boccaccio framed the Decameron as stories told by survivors sheltering from the plague, when painters began depicting the human body with an anatomical curiosity that had no precedent in evil art, these were not random developments. They reflected a civilization that had been forced, by unprecedented loss, to reconsider what a human life was worth and what it meant to be alive inside one. The plague returned. This is perhaps the most important and least discussed aspect of its legacy. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was not a single event followed by recovery. It was the beginning of a cycle. Major outbreaks returned to Europe in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, and recurrently through the following century. The plague of 1361 was called the Pestis Secunda, the Second Plague, and it killed with particular ferocity among children born after the first wave, who had no inherited exposure. Each return wave found a population that had partially recovered demographically and knocked it back again. Europe's population did not return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th century, nearly 200 years after the first outbreak. 2 centuries of demographic shadow, 2 centuries of recurring loss, 2 centuries of living with the knowledge that the dying was never entirely finished. What endures from all of this, across the distance of nearly 700 years, is something harder to name than a historical lesson. It is closer to a recognition. The Black Death revealed, with a clarity that no political or military catastrophe had previously achieved, that complex civilizations rest on assumptions about stability, about institutional reliability, about the basic continuity of the world from one generation to the next, that can be shattered faster than anyone believes possible. The medieval world did not think of itself as fragile. It had endured for centuries. It had its explanation, its hierarchy, its sacred canopy of meaning stretched over every aspect of human life. And then something invisible arrived from the east, moving along the roads built for commerce, and within 4 years had killed half the people the system depended on to function. The ruins that remain, the abandoned village earthworks visible from the air across the English countryside, the mass burial pits excavated beneath the streets of modern London, the interrupted churchyard records that simply stop mid-page, are not only monuments to the dead, they are evidence of how quickly the accumulated work of centuries can be interrupted. How much that seems permanent is, in fact, contingent. How thin the membrane is between the world we have built and the silence waiting on the other side of it. The plague did not destroy European civilization. In a strange and brutal way, it helped produce the civilization that followed, more questioning, more economically dynamic, more focused on the individual human life as something with inherent value. But that transformation came at a cost so enormous it resists accounting. Tens of millions of people died without understanding why. Entire communities vanished from the map. Children grew up in a world where half the adults they had known were gone, where the explanations they had been given for suffering had publicly failed, where the future felt, for the first time in living memory, genuinely uncertain. We live still, inside the world that catastrophe. The questioning of institutional authority, the restless search for better explanations, the sense that no social arrangement is permanent, these are not merely medieval legacies. They are the ongoing inheritance of a civilization that was forced in the space of 4 years to confront the limits of everything it thought it knew. The plague ended. The questions it opened have never entirely closed.